This video will begin to introduce you to the non-indicative moods in the Greek language. Particularly, we will be looking at imperatives and infinitives in this lecture. As I mentioned in the lecture on the Greek verb system as a whole, in all non-indicative moods, tense, whether something is present or aorist or perfect, really has to do with the kind of action that is being named. So aspect is what is important, not time. We remember that the major nuance of these tenses is that a present tense presents an action as an unfolding action, or an action in progress, or an ongoing action. The perfect tense stresses the completed aspect of the action, often including some emphasis on the results of having completed the action. Remember, perhaps, we spoke of the verb for standing, and the fact that the perfect tense expression, I have stood up, is virtually the equivalent of saying, I am standing. To say I have stood up is to indicate that an action has been completed, but also to make a statement about where one is now. Having completed the action, I am no longer sitting, I am standing. The aorist tense is really the absence of either one of these nuances. It is an unnuanced way of simply referring to the action without further ado. Thus, if we were thinking about a present imperative versus an aorist imperative, the difference between the two is that the present tense imperative adds this nuance of unfolding action or ongoing action. We will come to these translations shortly, but just to illustrate, a typical command that we might use is going to be the equivalent of an aorist command. If I say, go to the store, buy milk for me, these are simple commands. I am naming actions. If I were to say to my congregation, forgive each other, I would be giving a command simply calling attention to the action that I want them to exhibit. But if I were to give a present tense command in Greek, it would be the equivalent of saying not forgive each other, but keep on forgiving each other. Continue to involve yourself in forgiving each other. There would be this added nuance which stressed that I'm not just commanding an action, but I'm commanding, in some sense, ongoing investment in this action. Imperatives are familiar to English speakers. We tell someone to do something, we are using the imperative mood. Bring me my book. Turn off the water. We use imperatives all the time, hopefully with the word please. And when we typically give commands in English, we are giving second-person commands. I, or some we group, would be the first person. I am telling someone else directly, the second person, the you who's right in front of me, do this or do that. That would be a second-person command. Turn off the light. I'm telling, usually one of my sons, directly to do something. Clean up your room. whatever. We tend not to use third-person commands in English, but third-person commands are fairly common in the New Testament, as in Greek by and large. A third-person command, in effect, commands some third party, some onlooker or bystander, in effect, to do something. I'm not telling you to do something, but I'm saying, let the man or woman who wants peace forgive his or her neighbor. Well, I haven't told you to do anything. I have commanded a certain him or a certain her to do something. And in that example, I pretty much give one whole set of uses of third-person commands in the New Testament and in Greek more broadly. They're used to, in effect, indirectly command, inviting any one of the hearers to identify himself or herself as the person who is addressed by the command, who is the person to get the action done. As I say, we don't tend to do this in English, but if I were to walk into a classroom and say, let the lights be turned off, first you all would think I was very odd for doing that, instead of just looking at the person closest to the light switch and say, would you please turn off the lights? But if I were to say, let the lights be turned off, it would be an indirect command. Let the lights go out. With some third-person commands, you could expect the action to happen on its own, but of course in this instance it wouldn't. It wouldn't happen unless some member in that class identified himself or herself as the person to make the action happen. This happens then a lot in the New Testament. Let the person who has ears to hear, hear. Well, that's a third-person command. But it's not a direct one. You who have ears to hear, listen. So we'll see examples of both of these as we go. My point is simply that for the English speaker, it's the third-person command that takes a little bit more getting used to. Now, I never mentioned this in the video on the indicative mood, but the Greek word for not is effectively ou, omicron upsilon, or ook, omicron upsilon kappa. And this is the word that is typically used to negate an indicative verb. I was walking, fine. I wasn't walking. In that case, I would stick an ou or an ook before the Greek form. That means I was walking. But outside of the indicative mood, hence in imperatives or infinitives or any of the other non-indicative moods that we will yet encounter, the negator, the word for not, is may. Now, you'll never need to memorize these, but you will often see one of these in front of a verb, or not very distant from a verb, always before, but maybe not directly before. Maybe a few words might intervene, like adverbs or what have you. Nevertheless, this word is the equivalent of not in Greek. And again, with imperatives being non-indicative moods, the tense signals the aspect, not the time of action. So an aorist imperative is not a command for something to have happened in the past. An aorist imperative is simply a command. Do this. A present imperative adds the nuance of action in progress. Keep on doing this. Repeatedly do this. Keep doing this on the forefront of your agenda. Just It's an added nuance. So, in positive commands, a present imperative conveys a sense of ordering continued action or an ongoing engagement with an action. Thus, a lot of New Testament commands on the order of love one another aren't actually aorist imperatives, such as they tend to look in English, love one another. They're present imperatives, and what they're prescribing is a habit. Make this your habit, to love one another. So if I were looking at 1 Peter 2:17 in the Greek, I would see the commands to love, to fear God, and to show respect to the emperor. I would see those commands formulated with the present tense. And that adds the nuance that you see represented here. Keep on loving. Keep on fearing God. Keep on showing respect. Make these your habits. In negative commands, that is to say, an imperative that is preceded with the word may, that we just discussed, the present imperative often conveys a sense of telling people to stop doing what they're doing. So to cease a habit, to cease participating in an action in which they have been participating. So in Luke 6:37, in the middle of Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount, which we call the Sermon on the Plain, it isn't simply that Jesus says, judge not, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Because Jesus there is represented not using aorist imperatives, but present imperatives. So we capture the nuance there better if we hear it as stop judging, and you won't be judged. Stop condemning, and you won't be condemned. And then a present imperative, keep on forgiving. Make it your habit to forgive, and you will be forgiven. Aorist imperatives are the simpler ones. They don't have that extra nuance. They're simply do this action. A positive command with an aorist imperative simply puts a focus on commanding the action without the added nuance of the ongoing engagement in that action that is provided by the present tense. It doesn't say not to continually engage with this. It doesn't limit our understanding. It simply doesn't make that nuance explicit. Much like when you hear forgive one another. You don't hear that as saying forgive one another once and then stop. You simply don't hear the stress on keep on forgiving one another that you hear if it's uttered with a present imperative in Greek versus an aorist imperative. In 1 Peter 2:17 again, the first of the four imperatives in a row is actually an aorist imperative. We just read the three present imperatives, but these three are preceded by a simple aorist imperative. Show honor to everyone. And then, keep on loving, keep on fearing, keep on respecting. An aorist imperative with a negator, with may before it, simply focuses on negating the action. Don't do this, don't do that, as opposed to stop doing this, leave off doing that, which is the nuance with the present imperative when it's negated with may. I will say, however, that usually prohibitions, negative commands, usually they're not given with aorist imperatives. They're usually given with may, with an aorist of a different mood entirely, the aorist subjunctive, which we will come to in a future lesson. There are some places where you will simply encounter the future indicative, where really an action is being commanded. This is particularly true when God is speaking. And we've actually all engaged in this ourselves as parents. We have said, I presume that you all have, I can't begin to count how many times I have, but instead of commanding, say please when you ask for something. We might use a future indicative. You will say please when you ask for something. We tend to use this more when we're more exaggerated after nudging 1,000 times. You will take a shower before you come to the dinner table. That's an imperative, but the form of it is a future indicative. And I'm simply saying that that happens in Greek as well. Generally, no, in fact, I think one could say always, when a person of greater power, or a being of greater power and authority, is giving a command to someone of obviously less power and authority. The Ten Commandments, for example, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, use future indicatives. You will not commit murder. You will not commit adultery. We've already talked a little bit about third-person imperatives, third-person commands. These are actually given a name, especially in Latin. This is where I first encountered the name, jussives. They're not quite imperatives. They're a separate class, as it were, in Latin. And when we do employ them in English, if we were so nerdy as to use these labels all the time in common parlance, we would call them jussives in English as well. But we've already talked about those. Some of the most famous examples are "Let there be light" in Genesis 1:3, which is in fact a third-person command, which if we made it a second-person imperative, God would simply say, "Light, happen! Light, come into being." But instead of addressing the entity that actually isn't there yet, it's a third-person command. Let light happen. And it did. And this isn't a famous example, but it's a good one. In Hebrews 13:1, the author says, "Let brotherly and sisterly love continue. Let Philadelphia, that quality of sibling love, remain, or continue, or abide." Now, obviously, by doing that, the author is not commanding the abstract quality of love to continue. He is indirectly commanding the hearers in his congregations to continue to make brotherly and sisterly love the watchword of their relationships with one another. One thing just to bear in mind when we encounter the word "let" in these translations, let in English can sometimes mean allow. That is not the sense of let when translating a third-person command. When let means allow, as in "let the little children come to me," Jesus is actually using a second-person imperative to the disciples. Allow the children to come to me. Y'all allow the children. So that is different. The let in a third-person command is kind of a key word or a signal that some he, she, or it is being ordered indirectly to do something, and it has nothing to do with permission. I'm not making this an assignment by any stretch, but if you were to return to the Lord's Prayer, you would find a good concentration of imperative forms to look at. And you could do this with Bible works or Logos. If you were to look, starting in verse 9, you'd notice pros euch este, where Jesus is telling them, pray this way, pray this way. But pros euch este is a present imperative. So just from the fact that we'll just say Matthew has chosen a present imperative to render this, indicates Matthew's understanding that what Jesus was ordering here was not a one-time prayer, but an habitual pattern. So really, we could capture the translation of pros euch este better by saying, keep on praying this way, or make it your habit to pray this way. Then we get into the familiar, our Father, the one in the heavens, and we come to Hagios Theto ta onomasu. This is a third person imperative. It is an indirect command to God's name. In effect, commanding God's name to be hallowed indirectly, because we're speaking to God, and the prayer is, may your name be hallowed. Let your name be hallowed, but not let in the sense of I'm telling you to let something happen. I'm telling it to happen. And then, same thing with El Theto. Let your kingdom come. Another third person imperative. And then again, the Gene Theto, another third person imperative. Let your will be done. Or simply, your will be done. Not a direct command to the divine will. Will happen. Or a direct command to the kingdom. Kingdom, come. But indirect commands, all three. And again, one wonders about the impact of this. It could simply be a way of asking God to make sure that his name is revered, or to bring in his kingdom, or to enforce his will. It could be an indirect command, in effect, to oneself and one's community of hearers, as we pray this prayer together in the gathered assembly. When we pray, your will be done, effectively, we also have to decide that we are the agents by which that imperative is going to happen. We are going to take up fulfilling that command on behalf of everyone else who's praying it, as it were. Then we come to, and these are all aorist imperatives, by the way, which is why we correctly translate them simply in English. May your will be done, not may your will continue to be done. Let your kingdom come, not simply, or not rather, let your kingdom, be in the process of coming. Or may your name ongoingly be sanctified. Now, we're not praying against that by any stretch. We're just not stressing that because we've chosen aorist forms to express this prayer. And then, in verse 11, we have the command dos, which is the aorist imperative, second person, singular. So we're speaking directly to God, and our petition is give us our daily bread today. At this point, I'm just going to skip ahead to a slide and say, look at the difference in nuance between the Matthean form of this petition and the Lucan form. It's not a huge difference, but in Matthew, we had dos, which Logos or Bible Works will tell you, is an aorist imperative. Give us today our daily bread. In Luke, we have didu, amen. Didu is a present imperative. This adds that nuance that I've been talking about. So in Luke, we would render this more faithfully, keep giving us each day our daily bread. Again, that's not to say that that isn't what we're asking for in Matthew. We are surely every day asking God to give us our daily bread. And if I forget to pray this prayer tomorrow, I'm still hoping that God will, continue to give me my daily bread. But the point being, in the Lucan form, that is particularly emphasized and made explicit as part of the petition by virtue of having chosen a present imperative at that point. Aphes is another aorist imperative. Forgive us our debts. And even though the next verb is not an imperative, it's interesting to pay attention to, because aphekamen, if you were to look it up in Logos or Bible Works, you would see that it is an aorist indicative and not a present indicative. Why this often surprises students is that we are accustomed to praying the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our sins, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us, or forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. But in the Matthean form of the prayer, it's actually an aorist indicative, as we forgave our debtors, as we forgave those who trespassed against us. So really, in Matthew's model of this prayer, we are not asking God to do for us as we habitually do for others. We are asking God to do for us as we have already done for others, and we have not presumed to come to God asking for forgiveness before first forgiving those who have a debt to us, a debt of honor to us because they have offended us in some way. And then in the 13th verse, we have an example of that alternate way of creating a prohibition that I had mentioned earlier. This is not me with an imperative. This is me with a form of the aorist subjunctive, a mood that we will come to in a future lesson. But this is the more common way in Greek to say, don't do something. Don't lead us into temptation. But then we're back to a typical aorist imperative, but rescue us from the evil one. We move on then to the infinitive mood, which again is a mood that exists in English and we are quite accustomed to. Even a variety of tenses and a variety of voices. Tense being present or perfect, voice being active or passive. So we are used to present active infinitives, to heal, to save, to call. Also present passive infinitives, to be healed, to be saved, to be called, where the action now is happening to the subject, not to the object. We also know about perfect actives, where the infinitive, the action of the infinitive is being presented as a completed action. To have healed, to have loved, as in that somewhat insane maxim, better to have loved and to have lost than never to have loved at all. Those are perfect active infinitives, because both the loving and the losing are complete at the time of attempting to console ourselves with that maxim. And then a perfect passive infinitive, to have been healed, to have been loved. But again, speaking of and explicitly pointing out actions that have been completed. We also have a stative infinitive. I mean, it's not active, it's not passive, but the verb to be. It's kind of neither. And we can speak of to be as a present state, or to have been as a perfect, a completed state. And because infinitives are still verbals, they're still verb forms of a sort, they can have all the accoutrements of a normal verb. Infinitives can have subjects, direct objects, indirect objects, prepositional phrases, and adverbs. So all the things, all the parts of a sentence that we might attach to an indicative mood verb, we might also find in an infinitive clause. In Greek, we will encounter present, aorist, and perfect infinitives. And as with the imperative, these tenses really only point out aspect. So a present infinitive emphasizes the action in progress or ongoing engagement in the action. So instead of translating a present infinitive to pray or to be shaped, we would better capture the nuance of the present infinitive by rendering it to continue to pray, to keep on being shaped, to make it a habit to pray, or some such thing. The aorist infinitive is the bald action just by itself, without that added emphasis, hence to pray or to be shaped. And Greek perfect infinitives emphasize the completed action, just as they do in English. So to have prayed, or to have been shaped. As I say, often the perfect infinitive emphasizes ongoing results. Now this is more evident with a verb like shaping. To have been shaped means I am now formed in some way. So to have been shaped could, or I say, does both call attention to a completed action and to the fact that a new state of affairs exists because of that action. One of the peculiarities of infinitives in Greek is that the subject of the infinitive will show up in the accusative case. This is an exception to the rule that the nominative case is the case that expresses grammatical subjects in Greek, such as we encountered up to this point. One might find an infinitive with two accusatives close by, and one has to determine from context, just like the Greek hearer 2 millennia ago would have to determine from context and from sense which of the two accusatives is the subject and which of the accusatives is the direct object of this particular infinitive. I should point out at this point that some verbs actually take their objects in a case other than the accusative case. With some verbs, you will find the object really the equivalent of our direct object in the genitive case or the dative case. This isn't terribly frequent, And if you were to look up the Greek verb in a lexicon, a Greek English dictionary, almost all of them available, any decent one available, will tell you if that verb takes its object in a different case. Now, the infinitive is used in a variety of ways in Greek. I'm not going to belabor this part of this lecture, but we'll leave you to review the slides at greater leisure. But just to cover the basics here with you and walk you through it, infinitives can act as the direct objects of main verbs. They can function, in effect, as stand-ins for nouns. Think of the verb I want for a moment. I want could have as its object some noun. I want an apple. I want a new laptop. It could have as its object an action. I want to sing. The infinitive to sing is the object that is wanted. It is the direct object of the verb want. But it's not a noun, it's an infinitive. Some verbs require an infinitive really to complete their meaning. In Greek, there are certain verbs like melo, which means I'm about to do something, but it doesn't say anything about what that is. It's merely I'm about, and then an infinitive will complete that verb. To read, to preach. So, melo kerusein, I am about to preach. And you really can't have melo without an infinitive. Or the verb ophelo, a verb of obligation. I ought to do something. I am obliged to do something. Almost always will be found with a complementary infinitive. The infinitive, just as it can act as a direct object, hence standing in for a noun, can also stand in for a subject. Our familiar maxim, to err, is human. To err is the subject of that sentence. Human is the predicate. But the subject is not a noun, it is an action, represented by the infinitive. Similarly, in Greek, you could look up that famous line from Paul in Philippians 1, to live is Christ, to die is gain. The infinitive there is being used just as in English, as a subject. Occasionally, an infinitive, or a larger infinitive phrase, can be used to describe or fill out the meaning of a noun. Your wrath came, and the time came for the dead. What time came for the dead? The time to be judged. The time to give the reward. In this instance, the infinitives to be judged and to give are acting adjectivally, describing the time, telling us what time you're talking about. Another, well, in fact, a much more common usage than that, the infinitive can be used to express purpose. Just by itself, you might find an infinitive with another verb expressing the reason for that other verb being undertaken. I came to save. In this instance, to save provides the purpose of my coming. This might appear in Greek as a simple infinitive, just the infinitive by itself. It might appear with the word to behind the infinitive. That is the genitive of the word for the. At this point, you don't really need to know that. Just notice that the word to plus the infinitive can signal purpose. Or two Greek prepositions, eis or pros, followed by ta and an infinitive, can signal purpose. I think at this point, you might just think of this as a formula, just like in high school math. We wrote out formulas and learned them as formulas. I would see you just thinking eis, ta, plus infinitive, purpose. Pros, ta, plus infinitive equals a purpose clause. All that to say that in many of the instances in which we find a purpose clause in an English translation of the Greek, one of these four formulas, the simple infinitive, to plus the infinitive, eis ta plus the infinitive, or pros ta plus the infinitive, likely stands behind it. There is a fifth way of expressing purpose in Greek, but that will require a keyword hina plus a subjunctive verb, a mood that we will be getting to in a later presentation. The infinitive may also be used to express the result of an action, in which case you'll have the action named, and then the keyword hoste, followed by an infinitive or a fuller infinitive phrase. Hoste plus the infinitive gives the result of that action. So in Matthew, for example, he healed them, hoste, with the result that the crowd marveled. So here's the action, he healed, and the result is expressed in Greek with hoste and an infinitive, and as it happens, the crowd would appear in the accusative case as the subject of the infinitive, to marvel. The infinitive is also used in a number of other expressions where a preposition is linked with the infinitive by some form of what is called the definite article, the Greek word for the, and we will come back and talk about the article in a later lesson. But again, at this point, we might just focus ourselves on a number of formulas. Greek speakers could formulate expressions of time using prepositions and infinitives linked by an appropriate article. If I wanted to say, before such and such happened, I was a slave of sin, before such and such happened would be expressed, or would likely be expressed, with the preposition pro, which means before, and an infinitive. Before Christ came could be expressed simply by pro, to, the infinitive for coming, and Christ in the accusative case as the subject of this infinitive. Similarly, if a Greek speaker wanted to say, while action A was happening, action B happened. Well, action B happened, that's an indicative mood. But while action A was happening would be expressed using the second formula, the preposition en, with the dative form of the word for the article, plus an infinitive. In effect, in the doing, while this was being done, in the doing, as this could be thought of before the doing, and then after the doing. After action A happened, B happened. B happened would be probably in the indicative mood, but after action A happened would be expressed by meta, the Greek preposition for after, ta, the appropriate form of the word for the article, and an infinitive, after the doing, after so-and-so did this. To these formulas can be added one more. The preposition dia, followed by ta with the infinitive, is a common way for expressing cause or the reason for something. On account of action A happening, action B happened. In your work for this week, you're not likely to find a lot of these expressions. We will try to look at a few of them later, after you've gotten more of the basics down of infinitives and imperatives.